Hey guys, my name is Andrew Collins. This is my presentation on brood parasitism. So first, let's start off with what is parasitism in the first place. We usually think of parasitism as a type of relationship between organisms where one organism takes advantage of the other. Usually the parasite lives on or within the organism, so we can kind of define it as a behavior where one organism is living on or within another organism, causing them harm but not necessarily killing them. And usually we think of examples like endo and ectoparasites like leeches, roundworms, tapeworms, ticks, a lot of parasitic protists like uh, many amoebas and Lagardia glambia, stuff like that. But the thing is that's not the only type of parasitism that's out there. We have brood parasitism as well. This is a type of parasitism that focuses on taking advantage of other organisms to raise your offspring. And it's mostly seen in birds, but we'll cover some examples that are actually outside the bird family as well. So brood parasitism comes in two major types. Comes in facultative parasitism, where the parasite only sometimes parasitizes other organisms. It does actually have the ability to raise its own young, but sometimes when things are tougher, or maybe when it has a good opportunity to access a lot of resources, get a lot of energy, it'll take advantage of other organisms to take advantage of that opportunity. The other type would be obligate parasitism, where these brooding parasites can only reproduce by having some host raise their young for them. So a good example would be an experiment done with one of the most common brood parasites that are used as an example, the brown-headed cowbird. And here I'll bring up a little picture of one real quick. Looks a little bit like this. So some experiments done with this bird actually showed it rejecting any chance of building its own nest. It actually didn't know how to build a nest itself. When it was presented with other nests, however, it only focused on parasitizing those nests for other birds. But if it was forced to try and build its own nest, it would just completely refuse in those experiments. So really interesting. These obligate parasites have no idea how to raise their young anymore. And it's incredible that it's become an evolutionary trait to the degree that it has. So why is this such a beneficial evolutionary trait? Well, we got to think about the advantages that this parasitism brings to the organism and its population. It's an ecological advantage. There's better fecundity rates. And if you don't know what fecundity is, it is the amount of offspring an organism can produce by itself. And they get better fecundity rates because they don't have to spend as much energy on parenting. Because parenting is a very energy expensive task for an organism. Ask any human parent, how tired they feel. They feel tired all the time because they're having to take care of a crazy little 2-year-old. So it's an energy expensive process. So by dumping that workload on another organism, they can actually allocate more energy into just the production of their offspring. They can put more energy into the eggs. So these parasites typically have larger eggs than their hosts. And they can produce more eggs. So usually they'll parasitize many species and they'll just dump as many eggs as they can. And this increases their survival rates. They usually produce a lot of offspring from this behavior. And it's obviously given them a lot of success. Back to the cowbird example, cowbirds are a pretty big problem here in the U.S. and have caused a lot of birds to be endangered to an extent to where it's has to be noticed by somebody. But like I said, they save energy on parental care, they don't have to build nests. They don't have to build energy on resource gathering. And they don't have to defend their nests. Instead, they just watch the host nest instead. So a little bit more about the parent parasitism behavior. What do these parasites do to kind of make sure their offspring succeed? Well, these parasites will scout for other birds building nests during their free time. So, while these other birds are kind of spending all this energy building these nests, these parasites are watching to see who's doing what. And then they'll make their choice, depending on what's happening. When the host leaves to go maybe gather more branches for a nest, or maybe to get some food, these parasites swoop in. And it is at that moment that the parasite will possibly remove some of the eggs. They may eat them. They may just knock them out of the nest. Some species will leave the eggs completely alone. It kind of just depends. But after they remove some of those eggs, they'll lay some of their own in those places. And then they'll leave, keep an eye on that nest, and the host will return. And they usually don't notice. Or they have had some experience and know not to mess with those eggs. And we'll get more into that in a little bit. While the host is caring for the parasite young, the parents will watch the host. And if there's any kind of mistreatment of those parasitic young, some species will actually harass or attack the host. In some cases, they may even destroy the nest completely. So, sometimes it is a benefit for the host to not mess with the eggs at all. They can, either they can try and remove the host eggs and risk losing everything, or they can kind of just deal with it, and maybe some of their own offspring will survive the whole ordeal. Of course, it is difficult for their offspring to survive this whole ordeal because of the behavior of the parasitic offspring in the first place. So when these parasitic offspring hatch, they typically hatch earlier than the host offspring, and they typically are a lot bigger. They're very, very large, and they have larger mouths. These large mouths are a visual cue for the host parent. The host parent sees this large mouth, and they think, oh, it's time to feed the chick. But the problem is the larger mouth gets a better response. We kind of call this a code breaker. It's when an organism takes advantage of another organism's behavior for its own benefit. Well, these parasitic young are code breakers because these larger mouths are visual cues that actually attract more attention, and they attract that attention from the host offspring instead. So the host offspring doesn't get any food. These large, big-mouthed parasitic offspring get all the food, and it results in them surviving and the other babies dying in the process. These parasitic young will usually cry more often, on a more often rate, and they're usually louder too. So this increases the food that they get. But the worst part about it all is that they instinctively knock the host offspring out of the nest. So they may knock the other eggs out of the nest. If the eggs have already hatched, they may just straight up knock the baby chicks out of the nest too. They do this by instinct. They don't even know that they're really doing it. And at some point in the whole behavior, they'll end up being a lot larger, to the point where they're even larger than the parent host itself. But because of their behavior, they'll still get as much food as they want. Here's a good example. I got another picture that we can use. So the parasitic young is the one on right here, and there would be the host young. So notice how this one's much bigger. Its mouth is much bigger, and it got a bit of a head start on this guy right here because it hatched earlier. So keep that in mind. So the next topic we can talk about is kind of the evolutionary changes that have happened to kind of make this work. So, we have this whole issue of these false eggs being deposited into these host nests. So why don't these hosts recognize this more quickly? Well, over time, these brood parasites have actually created egg patterns that mimic their host eggs. So this is to help prevent the host from recognizing the parasite from their own offspring half the time. These parasites have many hosts, and within their eggs, they actually have a large variation in their egg patterns, or at least parasites that parasitize a lot of different hosts. Parasites that only parasitize one host usually have their eggs just like the host all of the time. But parasites that have multiple hosts will have a large variation in their egg patterns. So another example would be this, like this right here. So hopefully you can see that. Notice how all those different colors of eggs, it's almost like Easter. But this kind of gives them a bit of a gamble for this. So while some of those hosts that these parasites parasitize may not notice the difference between one color egg between another, other hosts are a lot more adapted to recognize those problems. So they kind of take a bit of a gamble with this. They create some random pattern and deposit it in some random host. And if that host is more adapted to recognize false eggs, they may get lucky and put an egg that matches the host pattern egg more closely and get away with it. While with other hosts, they may not need to worry about that at all. But this only improves their chances, is kind of the point behind all of this. And even more than that, they'll lay more than one egg most of the time. So by laying multiple eggs that have this single color pattern, they make the host have to guess between those two color patterns about which one's theirs. So this only increases their chances even further if they lay multiple eggs of the same color. So there is a bit of evolutionary warfare that's going on here, as you can tell. But just like the brood parasites have all these egg mimicry evolutionary traits going on, the hosts themselves are also evolving to counter this. Many brood parasites, like I said, have evolved this tricking method, but the host can actually detect visual differences in some species. A good example would be the pied wagtail. It can actually notice very minute color pattern differences in order to differentiate its own egg between a parasite egg. And they'll actually knock out the eggs that don't belong to them. Reed warblers, for example, will actually have specific alarm calls for when cowbirds are in their vicinity. So, cowbirds are a parasitic brood parasite, and whenever there's one in the area, these guys warn everybody of their species, all the reed warblers in the area, that, hey, there's a cowbird here, look after your nests. And then there's other birds like the superb fairy wren that actually teach their young a specific call to get food from them. So these guys they teach their young this call from the beginning. The young gives a little cheeping call that's unique to that, to that mother and young relationship. And the parasite can't reproduce that call, so they don't get fed as a result. So there's been a lot of adaptations that have kind of evolved to counter this whole egg mimicry behavior, which is really interesting. So let's talk about some examples of these brooding parasites. So one of the most common examples would be the cowbirds. They belong to the genus Molothrus, and the brown-headed cowbird is typically the go-to example because of how common it is. So remember that picture I showed earlier. So these guys are all over the states. They cause a lot of problems for many endangered bird species. That's partly because of all the urbanization that's happened. Or all the urbanization from human development has broken up our forests into pieces. And these guys are edge forest organisms. They live on the edges of these forests. And by breaking up the forest into all these pieces, it gives them more habitat to live in. So these guys are really thriving, and it's hurting other bird populations because of their specific type of behavior. Another go-to example would be the cuckoo. Cuckoos are found all over the world. Their species are found all over the world. The most common example would be the European cuckoo. So there's an example right there. So notice that it kind of looks like a predatory bird. And they use this appearance to really bully their host species. They're really aggressive. They'll not wait a second to knock the rest of the host's eggs out of the nest if they mistreat their young at all. And yeah, they are one of the best examples of the more aggressive displays in this behavior. Now, cuckoos and cowbirds aren't the only examples of this. We also see this behavior happening in African finches. So these guys belong to the family Viduidae, and is typically seen in indigo birds and whitas. The differences in these guys' behavior between them and the cuckoos and cowbirds is that these guys usually do not destroy the eggs in the nest that they parasitize. And many of these finches will only parasitize one specific species. So their eggs will typically look just like the species that they're parasitizing. Although there is an exception, the cuckoo finch, which is a kind of a yellowish looking bird. And it looks kind of like this. So these guys kind of copy the other behavior where they have a large variation in their eggs. So their eggs will have the many different types of color patterns. They'll take that gambling chance and try and get away with parasitizing multiple hosts. And if you notice in this picture, if you can see that properly, there's arrows pointing to their eggs in each of those examples. And it's really hard to tell the difference between those eggs and the host species. Almost looks exactly the same. So these finches will parasitize multiple hosts, kind of like the cuckoos and the cowbirds, thus where they get their name from. Of course, this isn't only seen in birds. There's other organisms that actually use this brood parasitism as an ecological advantage. The cuckoo wasp is a wasp that does this behavior as well. It parasitizes other paper wasps. It will lay its eggs in other nests. And the larvae are larger, and they typically do the whole "I'm hungry" signal more often than the other larvae. So they're relatively successful because they can take advantage of that other species as a parenting behavior and use it as a resource. The rover beetle is another example of a brooding parasite. It parasitizes ants. And it actually mimics ants to a degree. It really looks like an ant if you were looking at that from far away. These guys will lay their eggs in ant hills, and their eggs actually give off a pheromone that mimics young ant pheromones as well. So, these ants going through their colony kind of notice this pheromone. They're like, hey, you belong with the rest of the young ants. They'll take these eggs, put them with the rest of the young ants. These eggs hatch. And these rover beetles will actually grow larger than the ants, but they mimic this behavior where they tap on the lower jaw of the ants that are nursing them, and that kind of signals that parenting ant to give them food, and they can take advantage of that. And this is all instinctual, all genetically coded. And it's crazy how this has evolved over the generations. Last example would be the cuckoo catfish. This is a catfish that parasitizes cichlids. So these are fish that actually hold their eggs in their mouth until they hatch. So they nurse their eggs. So they take care of their eggs by holding them in their mouth, and then the eggs will exit their mouth once they hatch. Well, these guys go into these cichlids spawning sites. They'll swallow some of those cichlid eggs, and then they'll deposit some of their own in their place, kind of like the cuckoos and the cowbirds. And by doing this, the cyclids will just swallow all those eggs up together in one batch, and before you know it, they're raising the catfish young for them. What's even more interesting, though, is that the catfish young inside of their mouths will actually hatch ahead of time and feed on the other young before they exit the host's mouth. So, similar to the cuckoo, these brooding parasites, breeding parasitism in fish and insects. It's really interesting to see. So thank you for watching. I'm sorry for the potato quality. This is my first time doing a video like this, and my references will be in the video description. Thank you very much.